Hi everybody, it's Jeff from Close to Home in Glastonbury here with the April block of our Block of the Month series. Very excited to be heading into the spring here, well into the spring. We're getting some nice warm days out there. I hope everybody's enjoying the nice weather that we're getting, and hopefully the rain will stay away a little bit. And I wanted to remind everybody that we extended the voting for Marcia's Block of the Month from last year. So as long as you participated this year or participated last year, then you can vote for your favorite quilt. The quilts are online and they're also showing on the screen of the store. You have until Saturday, April 27th to vote for your favorite, and then we'll crown a winner after that. So without further ado, let's move on to today's block. It's going to be New Hampshire's Granite Rock. Here is our block for the month. Again, this is called New Hampshire's Granite Rock. You can see it kind of has a nice squared yet rolling design. You may also see this sometimes called in places Rolling Stone, or it has a few other names. This comes to us today from Workbasket magazine, which is a magazine that started in 1935 and ran to about 1949, which was really an extension of a studio called Aunt Martha. Aunt Martha is not a real person. It was a name made to invoke Americana with Martha Washington. But in fact, you can still find Aunt Martha patterns today. She has a lot of crochet patterns that are out there that are still available under the name Colonial Patterns or Aunt Martha. But a very cool block. I really think we made this granite rock kind of into almost like a cut gemstone with this nice tourmaline fabric, and I really like the way that this one came out. Here are all the pieces you're going to need for today's block. From the tourmaline there on the bottom, you're going to cut 4 2.5 inch by 2.5 inch squares, 1 4.5 inch by 4.5 inch square, that's going to be the center of the block, and 4 4.5 inch by 2.5 inch rectangles. From the background fabric, my black fabric here, you're going to cut 4 4.5 inch by 4.5 inch squares and 4 4.5 inch by 2.5 inch squares. And then from your accent color, which is my yellow here, you're going to cut 12 2.5 inch by 2.5 inch squares. First thing we're going to do is we're going to pair up our rectangles. So you're going to take your 4.5 by 2.5 inch tourmaline rectangle and a background rectangle, pair those all together, and once you sew them together and iron it, you're going to end up with 4 of these squares that are going to end up 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. The next step is to take our 2.5 inch squares, so that'll be 12 2.5 inch squares of the accent fabric and 4 2.5 inch squares from the tourmaline. And you're going to mark a diagonal line from corner to corner on the back of the fabric. And then you're going to arrange the squares just like shown here. So you'll take one of your accent squares and put it in one corner, take your tourmaline and put it in the other corner. Just make sure that those marked lines are just like shown here. And just like before, we are going to sew on our mark. Then we are going to trim a 1/4 inch away and iron those. I like to iron toward the smaller rectangles, or smaller triangles rather, or open if you prefer. I just wanted to stop here and make a quick note about doing a stitch and flip, which is what we're doing here when we sew on the marked line and trim afterward and iron those. If you find that your squares are ending up a little shorter than the 4.5 inch squares that we want, one thing to keep in mind when we do stitch and flip and sew on the marked line is if we sew exactly on that marked line, sometimes you're going to lose a little bit from that seam, especially if you iron to one side. If you iron open, you're not going to see this as much. So if you look very closely at this picture, you're going to notice when I call it sewing on the line, I am sewing just a hair outside of my mark, almost like a needle width over. And that's going to allow me enough space for the thread and the seam to take up, so that when I iron it, it's going to end up the right size. Now, if you don't have any issues with your finished size and everything's coming out good, like I said, especially if you're ironing open, don't worry about it. It should be, everything's good. But if you do iron to one side and you're noticing it's coming a little short, just keep in mind that that seam takes up a little space. So just go a hair outside of your mark whenever I say so on the marked line, and that will fix the problem. Once we've got our square open here, we're going to add 2 accent squares to the other 2 corners of our block. And again, we're going to sew on the marked line, cut a 1/4 inch, and iron those. And you'll end up with this square and a square block that has one of the corners a tourmaline and the rest are accent fabric. And you're going to make 4 total of these squares that will end up 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. From there, we're going to assemble our pieces here. So we have our rectangles that we squared together, our square and a square, and the middle is that 4.5 inch square tourmaline, and we're going to arrange them. We're going to sew our rows together. Then we're going to sew those columns together, and we end up with our lovely finished block. Again, I really like how this kind of got a cut gemstone look, and I'm very thrilled with how the quilt is going at this point. Very excited. I can't believe we're already 4 blocks in, and the next block will be available May 31st, and we will see you then. Have a great spring.